Looking back at older creepypastas, your mind may go to a couple of the big titans of the genre. Think Jeff the Killer, Smile Dog, and The Rake, but I always felt like one story was always a bit more underrated than those three. And while the story isn't underrated anymore, at the time of its release it was nowhere near as popular as a lot of the EXE and gaming creepypastas were at the time. That of course being the heavily atmospheric Mr. Widemouth. And before getting into the actual video, make sure if you haven't already liked and subscribed to the channel. Not only does it help me out, but it also lets you know whenever a new upload is, even if you know my schedule. Which for those who didn't know is every other Wednesday at 4 PM Central Standard Time. But let's get back to the video. I have read tons of different creepypastas, and hell, I have a whole series where I just review and rank all of them. And if you didn't know, this is actually part 5 of my ranking of all of them, but I felt like this one deserved its own video. The rest of it will be linked down below. Getting back, I've read them since I was a young kid, but for some reason over the years, one has always stuck with my mind. Well, actually, a couple to be more specific, but the ones I consistently found myself thinking about were Smile Dog and Mr. Widemouth. But comparing the two, I feel like I always heard about Mr. Widemouth a lot less than I did Smile Dog, because Smile Dog still was a really huge story. I just feel like its legacy has been forgotten a bit more than a lot of the other ones. And I'm going to give a really short summary of the story here, and for those who didn't know, Mr. Widemouth follows a kid whose family, which moves a lot, moves to rural Maine. We were living in a house just outside the bustling metropolis of New Vineyard, Maine, population 643. It was a large structure, especially for a family of 3. There was a number of rooms that I didn't see in my 5 months that we resided there. In some ways it was a waste of space, but it was the only house on the market at the time, at least within an hour's commute to my father's work. And upon moving into the house, he begins to get greeted by this odd creature. I don't exactly recall how I met Mr. Widemouth. I think it was about a week after I was diagnosed with mono. My first memory of the small creature was asking him if he had a name. He told me to call him Mr. Widemouth because his mouth was large. In fact, everything about him was large in comparison to his body. His head, his eyes, his crooked ears, but his mouth was by far the largest. Mr. Widemouth is described as being almost like a Furby, and upon further hanging out, Mr. Widemouth begins to ask our protagonist to do more and more odd requests. This is all despite his mono, which has him nearly bedridden, but the monster seems to not care and instead lures him up into a room that his parents had strictly forbidden. I like to play pretend up here, Mr. Widemouth explained. I pretend that there is a big, soft trampoline below this window and I jump. If you pretend hard enough, you bounce back up like a feather. I want you to try. I was a 5-year-old with a fever, so only a hit of skepticism darted through my thoughts as I looked down and considered the possibility. It's a long drop, I said, but that's all part of the fun. It wouldn't be exciting if it were only a short drop. If it were that way, you may as well just bounce on a real trampoline. Of course, despite Mr. Widemouth's constant pleas, the boy decides not to jump, prompting Mr. Widemouth to get a bit more creative with his ideas. The following morning, Mr. Widemouth arrives holding a small box. I want to teach you how to juggle, he said. Here are some things you can use to practice, before I start giving you lessons. I looked in the box. It was full of knives. My parents will kill me, I shouted, horrified that Mr. Widemouth had brought knives into my room. Objects that my parents would never allow me to touch. I'll be spanked and grounded for a year. Mr. Widemouth frowned. It's fun to juggle with these. I want you to try it. I pushed the box away. I can't. I'll get in trouble. Knives aren't safe to just throw around in the air. Mr. Widemouth's frown deepened into a scowl. He took the box of knives and slid under my bed, remaining there for the rest of the day. I began to wonder how often he was underneath me. I started having trouble sleeping after that. Mr. Widemouth often woke me up at night saying that he had put a real trampoline under the window. A big one that I couldn't see in the dark. I always declined and tried to go back to sleep, but Mr. Widemouth persisted. Sometimes he stayed by my side until early in the morning, encouraging me to jump. He wasn't so fun to play with anymore. This leads to a fight between the two, and upon getting better from mono, he shows the kid a trail, telling him to explore it when he gets older. His family then moves away where he sees Mr. Widemouth watching from a window, never to be seen again. Years later, he goes to revisit the house, checking where the trail led, which is of course the New Vineyard Cemetery. However, our writer notes that oddly the cemetery has a lot more child graves than is considered normal, meaning that Mr. Widemouth had done it before. 4. And that is Mr. Widemouth, and wow, what a twist. First off, compared to a lot of the other creepypastas, I really cannot rag on technical flaws here, as this story's execution is nearly flawless. There are no portions where the story seems to drag on too long or overstays its welcome, instead moving quite quickly along. This could have easily fallen into the tropes that plagued creepypastas, and comparing this to something like The Rake, this one instead offers a lot more subtlety. I cannot say I would really cut anything for pacing, as nothing here is really useless. Even the somewhat melodramatic narration at the beginning feels oddly fitting, as it gives the character an almost outsider type character, which works considering we learn that he was essentially raised as an outsider due to his illness, and thus his more overdramatic stylings keep him in character. And compare this to something like Sonic.exe, which I read in my last one, which was plagued with grammar errors, technical issues, and to the point where it was quite literally a struggle to read. In comparison, this feels like a breeze to read, as it reads just like an actual story, which, shocker, seems like a bare minimum, but a lot of the stories fail here. And not only is it an actual story, but like all good stories, it has self-control. I know this is something that I talk about constantly on this channel, but self-control is a giant aspect when it comes to writing. Overdoing something can be just as distracting as underdoing something, which is why films by directors like Michael Bay have been criticized for its rapid-fire pacing where not really enough gets explored. So when reading stories that aren't afraid to pull punches that also are able to know when to hold back, well, that's just not super common. Thus, there is already a higher level of writing here compared to a lot of the other creepypastas due to it just working as a story. And that's not even getting into the monster of the story. Compared to all the children-based urban legends we've covered so far, such as Where Bad Kids Go or The Rake, this one feels a lot closer to something that could actually be real. This is not me claiming that Mr. Widemouth could be an actual urban legend, but compared to a lot of the other ones, I feel like I could hear this story at a campfire, while something like Jeff the Killer I just cannot imagine in any sort of way. But you're telling me that while we had stories like this going around, many of us ignored it because we were too distracted by stories like Sonic.exe and fucking Blood Whistle? I know this story was big, but while I was hearing about Tails Doll in nearly every creepypasta video, I didn't hear about this one until hearing about the best creepypasta plot twists. So why was this one forgotten about compared to a lot of the others? Well, to call this one forgotten is a bit of an overstatement, as this one was still pretty popular and has remained that way for quite a bit, and I would actually say it's gotten a lot bigger than it ever has been because of shows like Creepcast. But when compared to the other big ones, it just didn't really have the recognizability that the other big ones really had. It doesn't have the image that makes something like Jeff the Killer that much more interesting, and doesn't have the name recognition of something like Sonic.exe, which has the entire Sonic franchise before it to build hype around the story. See, while making a memorable image or game was one of the key successes for a lot of other creepypastas, IPs were also a major aspect for them, and the story doesn't have either one of those. Even stories like The Rake, which weren't originally written with images in mind, had images added on to the story later. Also, this one feels a bit more mature compared to a lot of the other children-involved horror of the time, because it could have just ended with another gore fest with Mr. Widemouth being successful. However, it instead just does a slow reveal, showing that Mr. Widemouth might not have been successful with our protagonist, but he has been successful before. This plays off what a lot of the best urban legends do, which is the plausibility of it still being out there. What makes Slender scary isn't mainly his appearance, but rather the fact that you could run into him just walking into a random forest with no possibility of escape. It also builds this atmosphere that is hard to describe without just reading. It's really something else compared to something like Sonic.exe and Time Travel Journal. It really is such a breath of fresh air compared to a lot of the other ones we have ranked thus far. But while reviewing this, we got to look at the good and the bad with each story, and for this one there are a couple of small issues. Sometimes the pacing can be a bit off, and the bit can get old a little quickly, with the scenarios getting worse and worse. However, this didn't really bother me specifically, as the atmosphere the story was able to build kept me interested. Secondly, there's the monster's design, which I don't know what it is about it, but I just can't find Mr. Widemouth himself that creepy. It has the same issue for me that something like Child's Play has, where the horror here comes from the idea that it's putting a child at harm, and I get that, but it still never really makes the monster that frightening. In fact, it usually causes the opposite reaction for me, but oh well. However, you may have noticed that most of the issues I have with the story are more so personal gripes. That's because there really aren't any glaring super issues here, and the story uses the creepypasta format nearly perfectly. If you wanted to get someone into these kind of stories, then trust me, this one would be a great start. And with all those positives being said, I would have to give it a 9.5 out of 10. Remember, this is my scale specific for creepypastas, so while this score is quite high, remember it's still a creepypasta. Of course, that would mean putting Mr. Widemouth in the S tier, and it would be slightly higher than God's Mouth, being the best one thus far. And that is all for this week, so I'd like to ask, do you guys agree? Do you guys disagree? Let me know in the comments down below, and I try to respond to nearly everyone. And also, apologies in advance for not uploading last week and for the shorter upload. I know some of you guys may not be happy about the wait for a shorter video, but I was really sick for the past 2 weeks, so sorry about that. And thank you all for watching, and I'll see you all soon.